Getting to our speaker. How many people here have seen Mark speak before? Oh God, I'm going to read this big bio. Okay. Mark has insisted I cut this way down, these 2.5 pages of all his accolades. So I'll make it as quick as possible. And you know I can do this fast, okay? Mark is a Homeland Security expert with over 35 years of experience in the fields of intelligence, counterterrorism, and aviation security. He's taught courses at Eastern Kentucky University and the University of Southern California, as well as U.S. Coast Guard certified maritime security courses. I'm going to skip some of this here, Mark, because I know you want me to. Mark was in the Air Force for 8.5 years, served our country. Other professional assignments include serving as one of the original cadre of Transportation Security Administration, Federal Security Director. He has 14 years of experience as a civil aviation security manager, inspector, and intelligence analyst with the FAA in Washington, D.C. and Brussels, Belgium. He also served as a senior aviation security officer within the International Civil Aviation Organization. He graduated from Berkeley, Cal Berkeley. Go Bears! Entered a master's degree, government and national security from Georgetown University in Washington, and has completed all PhD coursework and comprehensive exam at Catholic University of America in Washington, D.C. But even more important, Mark was on our board for the Sunday Symposium and served as president for 4 or 5 years. And he's back. He's back. Thank you, Mark. I'd like to introduce you one of our favorite speakers, Mark Randol.
Thank you, Ginny. I'm listening to the biography. It was pretty clear to me I'm at the top of Elon Musk's cancel list if I was still in the government. Anyway, I want to start by just thanking everyone for your support and your trust during the past 4 years when I served on the board of directors of the OVA. As you know, there's term limits, and in April, I'm term limited out. So I won't be on the board anymore, but thank you for that. What I wanted to do, as you know, I've given a variety of talks on a variety of subjects, and today it's going to be a little bit of history and a little bit of travelogue, and it's a subject that's very interesting. How many people in the room actually grew up in the Bay Area? Oh, okay. So there's maybe quite a few of you who did not, or you have lived here for a while. So you may or may not be familiar with some of the history of the Bay Area in supporting the United States national security efforts. And I want to talk to you today particularly about the 20th century, but look at the contributions that the Bay Area has made over time. So with that in mind, let me get started here. First, we have to go and do a little bit of California history, okay? So what's interesting about the San Francisco Bay, it is one of the largest and one of the most important natural harbors in the world. And it lies in a very temperate area, by which I mean not storms, not ice, so it can be operating all the time. And it's right astride the Pacific Ocean. But what's interesting is that how late Europeans discovered the San Francisco Bay. So you have here the great sea captains from the 16th and 17th centuries. Juan Francisco Cabrillo, the Portuguese sea captain in 1542, sailed up the coast of California and did not see the entrance to the San Francisco Bay. 30 years later, Sir Francis Drake, the English privateer, he also sailed up the California coast, missed the San Francisco Bay, and is believed to have landed in a bay just to the east of Point Reyes. That bay is now named after him, but here's another trivia for you, was not named after him for almost 200 years. And it was named by the English navigator George Vancouver. Sir Francis Drake did not discover the bay. And then in 1602, the Spanish sea captain Sebastian Vizcaíno was charting the California coast, whizzed right by the entrance to the San Francisco Bay, went as far as Cape Mendocino. Again, never saw the bay. So why was this? Why was it that they never saw the bay during those years? And the answer is historians believe have postulated three reasons. The first one of these is that, as you know, they were powered, these ships, by sail. So the captains never wanted to sail too close to shore because they could get blown onto rocks that were not known and seen because the area was not charted. So they sailed a little bit off the coast. And as a result of that, with optics being primitive at the time, they could not see really super great distances. So that's one reason that they didn't see it. A second reason is that if you sit off the coast and you look through the Golden Gate, now today there's a bridge, that's a big tip off. But back then, this was a very narrow strait, the Golden Gate Straits. And if you look, you'll see Angel Island and Alcatraz, and they kind of line up, and together with the Berkeley Hills in the background, so that from the distance that they would be looking and viewing, it looked like solid land. So they did not see that there was an opening into a bay. And the third reason, which is, okay, so here I wanted to highlight the bay here for you. By the way, the great sea captains did not discover Oakmont either. So I wanted to show you how this is. And look how narrow the Golden Gate Straits are there. Okay, this is a good view of it. The third reason, though, is this one, the fog. Now, I didn't have to show you a picture with just the tip of the Golden Gate Bridge to prove to you that it's foggy in the San Francisco Bay Area, but just to make sure, that is one of the biggest reasons they never would have seen it. They would not have had the benefit of the top of the Golden Gate Bridge to tip them off, of course, at that time. So they did not see the bay. And it took several decades later before the bay was discovered, and it was discovered by land. Okay, so here's the map in the 18th century of the the Viceroyalty of New Spain. And you'll notice to the north is something called Alta California, which actually consisted of California, parts of Southern Oregon, all of Nevada, all of Arizona, and all the way into Colorado. It was a very large tract of land and very sparsely populated. And what the Spanish discovered was that they were seeing encroachments coming from the Russians. You'll notice they settled, set a settlement up in Fort Ross, not far from here. They saw the British moving west through Canada. And so they were very interested in asserting the sovereignty of the area that they had. So they sent a couple of expeditions out to explore the area. And one of these, very important one, was the De Portola expedition in 1769. And it went north looking for Monterey Bay, which had been discovered by the great sea captains, but they went right past Monterey Bay and they kept going and they kept going. And at one point they were bivouacking and a party from the expedition broke off and went hunting. And they went to the top of the mountain that is now known as Montaro Mountain in the Santa Cruz Mountains. And they looked out, and to the north, they could see Point Reyes and Drake's Bay, and they could see the Farallon Islands. But when they looked east, they saw a great bay. And they were the first Europeans to see the San Francisco Bay. And this is what one of the members of the expedition wrote in his diary. Can everyone read that? I'll read it. A very fine and large harbor, such that not only the navy of our most Catholic Majesty, but those of all of Europe could take shelter in. And he was absolutely right. So when word got back that there was this bay, they sent another expedition in 1775, 1776, this being that of Juan Bautista de Anza. And an expedition, it was practically moving a city. They gathered up families. They had like 1,000 head of cattle. So this massive a group headed north, and they went all the way to the tip of the peninsula of San Francisco. And they said, okay, this is as far as we're going. There's the bay. And they established a small settlement, and they built a military garrison, in Spanish, Presidio. Now, what was interesting about this area was that it was windy and its soil was poor. And it was hilly. So it was not particularly good for farming. And so they struggled a bit. But if they went on top of one of those hills and it was a clear day, they could look east to the opposite coast of the bay, in Spanish, Contra Costa. And if it was really clear, they could see in the distance snowy peaks, which they called the Snowy Mountains, in Spanish, Sierra Nevada. So the Presidio of San Francisco was built and somewhat languished there for quite a while, but they did realize the strategic importance, and so they fortified it. This is a lithograph from the early part of the 18th century of what the Presidio looked like. So it's not a photograph, they didn't have that then, but it's a lithograph that gives an idea of what that would have looked like back then. Meanwhile, all the way to the east, we have the United States of America in its early infancy, but California was still pretty much a backwater, even within the Spanish Empire. And they fortified it, as I said, with Spanish cannon. And today you can go visit the Presidio and you can see these cannon on display. There are 6 of them. Well, moving on to the 19th century, there was a lot of political transition. And this is another lithograph of San Francisco from about towards the mid part of the 19th century. And it looks really different without a bridge there, doesn't it? So by then, Mexico had achieved its independence in 1821 from Spain. And this is now what it looked like. The green parts, in dark green, is kind of what you recognize as Mexico, plus the gray part, which is Baja California or Lower California. Alta California or Upper California is still there, still occupying that position. But the Mexicans had a huge illegal immigration problem. Thousands of settlers from the United States were moving into their territory in Alta California. They were undocumented, and they were plopping down, building homes and building farms. And the Mexicans, who in the Hispanic population of California, they were known as Californios, were very, very upset about this. And so they actually passed a law that prohibited these so-called illegal immigrants from being able to own land without going through a certain process. But this was starting to create conflict between the Americans that were flooding into Alta California and the Californios, the Hispanic Mexican citizens that were living there, still rather sparsely populated. Well, at one point in 1846, a small group of them, who called themselves, a small group of the American settlers, calling themselves Osos, or Bears, decided that they'd had enough with Mexican rule, and they attacked the garrison, the Presidio that had been located in Sonoma. Now, right down the street in Sonoma, General Mariano Vallejo had moved the main garrison out of San Francisco because it was hard to supply and nobody wanted to be there. It was too cold. So he built Sonoma, and he owned lots of land here. Now, Vallejo is a very interesting character, one of the most important figures, certainly in California history, if not also American history. But his belief was that the future of California was with the United States, not with Mexico. So he was sympathetic, but they basically went in, the Bear Republic revolutionaries And he invited him into his house and fed them lunch and some brandy, and they sat down and worked out a surrender agreement. He ended up getting detained for a couple weeks anyway, but they liked him a lot. But shortly thereafter, the Bear Republic flag was raised in Sonoma, and then the United States military occupied the area. Okay, so it was not officially part of the United States, but already the assertion of Americans in this region was very, very big. Not long after that, in January of 1840, oh, by the way, about a month after the flag went up in Sonoma Plaza, then the Americans found out that the United States had declared war on Mexico for a lot of other different reasons, but the Mexican-American War was going on. In 1847, the Treaty of Cayuga was signed, which officially gave California to the United States. This was not a prize from the Mexican-American War. There was conflict as a result of that war, but it was before that that California became annexed by the United States. And then in 1848, the Treaty, as you know, of Hidalgo, Guadalupe Hidalgo was signed, which gave all of Texas, the New Mexico territory, all to California. 55% of Mexico's land then became part of the United States of America. In 1850, California became a state. Now, to heap insult on injury, in 1848, they discovered gold in the old territories that Mexico had. And not a little bit of gold, but a lot of gold. And that's when things really started to pick up for Northern California and the Bay Area with its great San Francisco with its Great Bay, because now this is where ships would be coming in with supplies, gold would be going out, and this was really going to grow that area. Okay, here's an actual photograph. This is San Francisco Harbor. This is Yerba Buena Cove in 1850. You can see all the ships there. That's Yerba Buena Island. And in the distance, you can barely make out the Berkeley Hills. So very important for bringing supplies as the population started to soar now in this area. So what happened during the Civil War? During the Civil War, gold from California basically financed the war effort. It backed up the United States currency, prevented inflation, and gold was flowing out of San Francisco Harbor back east. Very, very important piece of the Civil War history was the role of the Bay Area as a shipping point for all of this gold that was being found. And of course, the United States military knew that other countries might covet that, including possibly the Confederates who had warships. And so they fortified the bay. And they found the best place to do this was on Alcatraz Island. This is long before it ever became a federal penitentiary. And they built several batteries on Alcatraz with these large cannons or guns, officially guns. And this is an actual photograph from that time. They also put fortifications at Fort Mason, which at that time was called Point San Jose. This is called the West Battery. And look where it's looking out onto. It's looking out onto the Golden Gate Straits. So between Fort Mason on the San Francisco side and Alcatraz, they could, just destroy any hostile ships that might come into the bay. I really like this particular picture. You've got these poor soldiers out there guarding this gun, but what I really like about it is over here we have this goat sort of, enjoying things. But anyway, this is also a photograph from that period of time. So very important to protect the bay during the Civil War. Okay, so this is what the West Battery looks like today. So you can go and visit these places. Now, as the century went on, we began to have conflict with Spain. As you know, we eventually had a war, and coastal fortifications were set up. And I know this is a really busy slide. The only thing you can really make out is Highway 101, which was not there in the time frame that we're talking about. But if you look here, this blue line, of course, is the coastline with the Pacific. And this line is the coastline with the bay. And all the pink things excuse me, all of the pink things are various fortifications that were set up again to protect the bay. So I'll go through a few of these. This is another photograph. This is at Battery Bluff, which overlooks Crissy Field. You can see Alcatraz there in the distance. Great photograph there. And this is what Battery Bluff looks like today. Have any of you visited these areas, the Presidio? Okay, a handful of you. By the way, this spot right here, you have visited whether you knew it or not. You were actually underneath because this is above the tunnels of the Presidio Parkway, the new Presidio Parkway, going to the Golden Gate Bridge. So when you come off the Golden Gate Bridge and head to the city, you go underneath in the tunnels, and on top is Battery Bluff. And this area is called Presidio Tops, and you can picnic, you can walk around, see a lot of very interesting things. So here's another one of the batteries. This one is facing out to the ocean. This is Battery Cranston. There are numerous batteries. Again, here, let me see. Oops. I love this guy here. He's got the binoculars going, looking out to sea for any enemy ships. And this is what Battery Cranston looks like today. Terrific views. And you can drive out on the Presidio and you can stop and you can see these things if you ever have an inclination. And as I say, they have great views. And this is a test firing of Battery Godfrey, a wonderful photograph from that era. This is 1897. And I don't see any ear protection on those guys. And I can tell you, there's probably some burst eardrums in there. And that's what Battery Godfrey looks like today. All right, here we go, the 20th century and the United States at war. So this was a period of time when the Bay Area especially had a very, very prominent role because it was located strategically right on the Pacific, and we went to war with Japan, obviously at the end of 1941. So it was very, very important, the seaport and building the ships that would support the war effort. And some 30 shipyards, together with numerous machine shops and metal foundries and so forth, came together to create the largest shipbuilding complex. And whenever wars happen, there are always great social, political, and economic changes that affect the societies, don't they? And this was especially true in the Bay Area because of the numerous changes, women entering the workforce, and all of these things. So how did all of that happen exactly? Well, it happened, in the words of the documentary filmmaker Christine Nee, because the War Department decided that the Bay Area was the best place to build a navy. And this became the largest shipbuilding complex in the United States. It built 45% of the cargo tonnage, one area, 45% of the cargo tonnage in World War II, 20% of the warships, all coming here. But what was significant was how they were able to do it. Because so many men went off to war, they had to recruit elsewhere. And thousands of African Americans from the South and thousands of women went to work for the first time. And why was cargo tonnage important? Because during the war, it took 15 tons of supplies to support one soldier and one Marine for 1 year. And that's not because they ate so much. But what we're talking about here is the munitions, the food, the oil to fuel the equipment, both ships and land-based vehicles and so forth. And so cargo ships and tankers were absolutely essential to the war effort because they had to go across great ocean, the Pacific, to fight against Japan. And over 1,400 of these ships were built in the Bay Area between 1942 and 1945. This is an extraordinary number. I don't know how many of you know, but today, the United States Navy, shipyards in the United States, produce for the Navy about 3 ships a year. 3 ships a year. Okay? So there's a lot of reasons for that, but just to put that in a little bit of perspective. One of the biggest of the shipyards that was started by Henry J. Kaiser, and he established 4 shipyards in the Richmond area. And these would be managed by the Permanente Metals Corporation, and 747 ships would be built there. This is an aerial view of the shipyards and the ways. They now have a Rosie the Riveter National Memorial at this site. How many people have had a chance to visit that? Okay, well, for those of you who have not done that, it's easy to get to. It's right off of 580 when you come off of the Richmond-San Rafael Bridge, and it's a great, great little memorial. And it's hard to believe all of the work that was done there. But what was particularly the reason why it was built there was it was located at the end, the terminus of the Santa Fe Railroad, and Kaiser pioneered a new way of building ships, which was to source prefabricated parts and then weld them together in the shipyards. So at that time, of course, they needed labor, and that's when women entered the workforce in a big way. And this is the famous Rosie the Riveter poster, but because of the type of shipbuilding that was there in the Bay Area, it was welding, not riveting. The women were welders, and so it was more like Wendy the welder. Okay. And here's some examples of women who were doing all of the hard jobs, just as the men that were still working in shipyards. On the left, those are women doing, they're called cutters. That's a very hard and skilled position. And then, of course, welders there on the right-hand side. But the photograph here that I want to show you that I think is most interesting and more an accurate portrayal of what this was like. And that's this photo here, African-American women and a couple of men. You can see in their faces the hard work and what it took to do this, to build these ships. And it wasn't easy. Just because women were allowed to come into the shipyards, discrimination was still very high. For example, they would not let them, the unions would not let women join the union. And this was very, very controversial. So in the early stages in 1942, they had a vote. The International Brotherhood of Boilermakers had a vote, and it was a 12,000 to 7,000 vote in favor of admitting women. But the union leadership disallowed the vote on a technicality. Well, several women were furious, so they stormed the offices of the union in Sausalito. And 2 days later, the union gave in and then rewrote their bylaws to permit women. But there was still discrimination against African Americans, but generally speaking, things were changing. There were getting to be an integrated workforce. White men were now working alongside of Black men, and white men were working alongside women for the first time. And this was a sea change. And it was the most in the Western United States, where the most of the women and African Americans had moved to work. So I wanted to show you this interesting picture here. This is yard number 2. The Liberty ship, Robert E. Perry, built in 4.5 days. Now, this was, of course, a bit of a publicity stunt, because most of the ships, I mean, didn't get built that quickly, but they got built fast. But this is a Liberty ship, and there's the people celebrating that. I'm sorry these photographs aren't a little easier to read, but that's the state of photography back then. So I have to go with what's there. Another important revolutionary activity or thing that came out of the war was health care for workers. You know, in the old days, if you got sick, you went to the doctor and you paid him, or you went to the hospital and you paid him. But Kaiser ran into a big problem. He had a workforce, and he knew if the workforce was going to be productive, they needed to have decent medical care. And he was also inheriting a lot of workers who had lived through the Depression and had a lot of sicknesses and chronic conditions coming out of the Midwest or the South, especially. And they came in. So he was, how do I do this? So he had worked before with a surgeon named Sidney Garfield about a new concept, which was based on a prepaid model and focused a lot on preventative health care. So he decided to set this up in the Richmond yards, and he paid most of it, but there was a small amount that was deducted from the workers' paychecks. But they now had the clinics and the doctors on staff, because with a prepaid thing, they could afford to invest in that infrastructure. And they had the doctors on staff to be able to take care of the workers. And this carried over because in July 1945, they decided to open this health plan to the public. And 300,000 people signed up in the first 10 years. And since then, they now have Kaiser Permanente, now has over 12 million people enrolled, 9.4 million in California. But Kaiser Permanente, Kaiser was the pioneer behind this. So here's a nice view. I just thought I'd take a break here. Let's look at Sausalito, some of the fanciest land and expensive land in the Bay Area, right? Anybody go to Sausalito for lunch? Okay. Here's what Sausalito looked like in December 1944. This is an aerial view of the Marin shipyard. This is actually Pine Point in Sausalito, which didn't have very many people living there in 1942. The War Department went in and said we need an emergency shipyard, and the Bechtel company went in to do it. And they basically evicted all of the people that lived there, tore their houses down, dynamited the point, filled in all the marshy land, and they were building ships within 3 months. And this is what it looks like. Here's another view of it. Okay, that's looking to kind of the north there. So you can see the Marin Hills. You're familiar with the geography, but it's interesting what Sausalito looked like back then. And Marin Ship was, there in Richardson Bay, and became one of the most important shipyards in the Bay Area supporting the war effort. Now, of course, when you have all these thousands of people coming to work, many of them from out of town, they needed housing. So the federal government built Marin City with houses for shipyard workers. And, it's not the fanciest stuff. It's not the kind of places you see in Sausalito today, but this is what they had to do. And this was actually a big challenge for workers, was to find housing. Some of them lived in trailers. There were tent cities. They shared, units. So this was a big challenge to get enough housing for workers. And just to kind of put you in the perspective with the map, if you look at the point there where it says the Bay Model Visitor Center, that's actually where the Marin shipyard was located, and you see Marin City just above it. But that's where that was located, and who'd have known that Marin Ship was such a big shipyard back then? And this is one of the Liberty ships, the 12th of 15 that Marin Ship built. In 3.5 years, they built 15 Liberty ships, 6 fleet oilers, 62 tankers, and a total of 93 ocean-going vessels in Marin Ship. Tankers, very important, that carried the fuel. So there were different types of ship. You had break bulk cargo ships, and you had tankers and so forth. So there's the Peter Donahue. There's people celebrating the launching there in the foreground. Let's move around and visit some more shipyards. Everybody knows about Mare Island. And Mare Island was one of the most important shipyards, not only in World War II, but after World War II. And it was the very first shipyard built on the Pacific coast of North America in 1851. Well, at the outset of the war, it was ready to go, and numerous ships were being repaired there, being built there, and so forth. Marin Island Shipyard outside of Vallejo. This is the USS San Francisco, a heavy cruiser that was built at Mare Island and launched in 1933. It served several trips to the Pacific fighting Japan, 17 battle stars, one of the most decorated ships. It fought in the Battle of Okinawa and Battle of Guadalcanal. So important ship that was built there at Mare Island. And the big thing Mare Island was especially known for is it built a lot of the submarines. And here is a lineup of some of the submarines at the end of the war that they had built for the United States Navy. And then they continued to build submarines, including the nuclear-powered submarines in the Cold War. Okay, and then later it became the base for some of the United States Navy's ballistic missile submarines. In 1977, when I was an ROTC cadet, Air Force ROTC cadet at Cal Berkeley, I had a chance to visit the USS George Washington, a ballistic missile submarine that was there at Mare Island. That was very interesting. Mare Island was one of the most important shipyards we've had. This is not a private company. It was not Kaiser. It was not Bechtel. It was owned by the United States government, by the people. But in 1996, they decided to close it down, and it devastated the community of Vallejo. Hey, before there was wine, there was shipbuilding in Napa. Did you know that? So basalt started out as a rock quarry operation, but then they decided to get into making barges, and the Navy caught their attention, and then they opened a shipyard also, and basalt built a range of ships. And I'm gonna have to read this because there's a couple things I want to make sure I get right. So they built 6 bolster-class salvage vessels, 16 diver-class vessels, 115 barges, a tug, 2 coastal tankers, 9 coastal freighters, and 32 rescue ships. Now, you wouldn't think that these were things that you needed, because in the war, you're thinking battleships and cruisers and submarines. Okay, a few cargo ships. But in fact, there's a whole lot of ships that are needed for a Navy to function. And I've got to tell you, you've got to love the name. Oh, I'm not sure I'm going to be able to read this now because... let me see if I can scroll down on my notes here. You got to love the names of the ships. Oh, yeah, that's what I wanted to do. All right, so here are the names. Some names: diver, escape, grapple, shackle, preserver, curb, cable, chain, seize, snatch, bolster, hoist, toiler, the urgent, the willing, and this one, the grasp. Now, this was a Navy rescue ship built in Napa by Basalt in 1944. And what's interesting about this ship is it's still in service today in South Korea. So Basalt Shipyard, you can see what was part of that when you go over the Napa River and you look up. So let's keep moving through the Bay Area and some of its most famous shipyards. Hunters Point, everybody knows this one in San Francisco, another very important shipyard. It started in the late 19th century, and Theodore Roosevelt was so impressed that he called it the greatest shipyard in the world, and he trusted his great white fleet of battleships to be serviced there. Well, in World War II, it was very large and had a ready workforce, and so it became very, very important also for the U.S. war effort. And for those of you not immediately from the Bay Area and you say Hunters Point, okay, I've heard of that, but where is that? Here's a map that kind of shows you, if you want to look out at the point there, and see if I can sort of highlight that. Now, there's another point here. Does anybody know the name of that one just to the south? Candlestick Point. There used to be a ball yard there. Okay, not anymore. I wanted to also call your attention, if I can do this without, here, because I'm going to talk about Naval Air Station Alameda in a minute, but that's where that is, so you get a little perspective with this map. So here is 4 Essex-class aircraft carriers at Hunters Point: the Boxer, the Shangri-La, the Intrepid, and the Hornet. Who knew that we had an aircraft carrier named Shangri-La? But we did, and it came to Hunters Point for servicing. And everybody knows this ship, the battleship USS Iowa, coming into dry dock for servicing at Hunters Point. Don't you love those old cars? You know, that almost looks like the Oakmont car show down there. But that's what people drove in those days. And people didn't just come to work. You know, they formed up and they marched. Just kidding. Okay, how many people have seen that guy? It is a major landmark in the Bay Area. You can see it pretty much if you get a view of the Bay or of the city, you're going to see that. And that was the largest crane in the world when it was built in 1947. And it had an important role. It was designed to lift the massive turrets out of the battleships so that they could be repaired, refurbished, and new turrets put back in. But it also did some other things, which I'm going to show you. And it was the largest crane in the world until 2019, when the Big Carl was built in England. And now that's the biggest, but this is still the second biggest. So this is an interesting project supporting the US war effort during the Cold War. These are Polaris missiles being fired off, and the crane is holding a resting cable so that the missile would go up and be captured, and then it could be taken down and studied, because we were getting ready to deploy Polaris missiles onto submarines under our ballistic missile submarine, part of the strategic triad. So that was an important role for the big crane at Hunters Point. And here is a 1971 during the Vietnam War. We have 3 carriers here at Hunters Point: the Hancock, the Coral Sea, and then in the dry dock is the Ranger. Hunters Point is closed today. Here's what it looks like today. It is closed and it's a Superfund site. And there's been all kinds of fighting back and forth, who's supposed to remediate, how fast. But that would be prime land if it could be reoccupied for any purpose, including a shipyard if needed. So I mentioned Naval Air Station Alameda. This is a very important facility in the Bay Area on the island of Alameda, astride the Oakland estuary. And again, I love maps and aerial views of things. This is such a great map of the East Bay looking out to the north. And I'll show you where the Alameda Naval Air Station's here. Of course, over here is the old Richmond, where the Richmond yards were located. Okay, so that gets you an idea what that looks like. During World War II, it was supporting a lot of ships also. Here's the aircraft carrier Yorktown being loaded in 1943. Interesting trivia question. Richard Nixon served in the Navy in World War II, and his first assignment was at Alameda. Another interesting thing with an Alameda connection is Jimmy Doolittle, who led the famous raid against Japan in 1942. He was born in Alameda, and the 16 B-25 bombers that took part in the raid were loaded onto the the Hornet, were loaded onto the Hornet in Alameda, and then it set off for the Pacific. And this is a photograph of Jimmy Doolittle taking off from the Hornet. Now, the Hornet that did the Jimmy Doolittle raid was actually lost during the Battle of the Santa Cruz Islands, protecting the beachhead at Guadalcanal. But they built a new Hornet, CV-12. That's this ship, also named Hornet, and it served in the Pacific at the end of World War II, in Korea, and during the Vietnam War. And here, it's recovering the Apollo 11 astronauts after they came down from their mission to the moon. And there it is here. That's the Hornet. They also recovered the Apollo 12 astronauts. Today, the Hornet is a Sea, Air, and Space Museum. And you know what? You can even book a sleepover there and sleep in the bunks that the sailors slept in. So that's something you might be interested in. And here's another map with the Naval Air Station, also since closed. Congress seems to hate the Bay Area in spite of what we've done for them. So that shows you where the Hornet Sea, Air, and Space Museum is located, right down here. And then when you've done your visit, you can go over here and get lunch at the In-N-Out Burger and maybe shop at the Target. And here in 1974, right at the tail end or just after the end of the Vietnam War, here were the aircraft carriers, 4 of the aircraft carriers that were stationed there. Okay, that's the Coral Sea from left to right. The Coral Sea, the Hancock, the Oriskany, and the Enterprise. The Ranger was the other one that's not here in dock at the present time. And later, the super carriers, the Nimitz class super carriers, 2 of them were also stationed here. The Abraham Lincoln and the Carl Vinson. So I couldn't leave the Oakland area without giving a shout out to Moore Dry Dock. Moore Dry Dock was a very important shipyard on the West Coast at the start of the war, and it produced scads of ships as well. This one here is the launching of the Warhawk, which is a troop transport, but very important during the war. And I want to keep going just real quick and mention 1 or 2 others because it's so important, the contributions they made. Let's go south part of the bay to Sunnyvale. This is the Joshua Hendy Iron Works. And this gigantic thing here is a triple expansion steam engine, which were the engines that powered the Liberty ships. And these were built at Joshua Hendy, as well as the steam turbine engines for the Victory ships. Now, how big is this? Whoops. Let me see if I can see that man there. Okay, so this is like 2 stories. These are big. And there's a woman there testing one of the pieces of equipment inside Joshua Hendy in Sunnyvale. Okay, I want to take a pause away from the good side of the building in the area and everything that entailed and talk about some of the tragedy that also had happened here in the Bay Area. And many of you have probably heard of the Port Chicago explosion, which is one of the great disasters and tragedies of World War II. And here's where it's located. This was very important. It was a naval magazine, and it's up in the Sassoon Bay, and it was away from population centers, but it was where the rail lines also came in. So munitions would come in on the rail lines, and they would be loaded on the ships, and then the ships would go off out into the Pacific. Well, on July 17th, 1944, the 2 ships were being loaded here at the pier, the Victory ship Quinault Victory and the Liberty ship, the E.A. Bryan. And in those days, it was black sailors that did the loading because black sailors always had the most menial jobs in the Navy. They were stewards or other kinds of cooks. They never, did any of the important jobs, and they were very much discriminated against, and the Navy was especially bad. And so they were stuck with this very dangerous job. But what made it worse was these crew received no training in loading munitions. All of their officers were white, and they didn't have any training. Well, a new commander had come in and he wanted to speed up the loading. And pretty soon the white officers were betting each other whose 100-man crew could load the ships the fastest. On the night of July 17th, there was a small explosion, a fire, and 6 seconds later, an enormous explosion that wrecked through the entire pier. It did incalculable damage. It killed 320 people, including 203 Black sailors who were loading the ships. It killed all of the crew on board the 2 ships, plus others that were all around. The Quinault Victory was broken, exploded into 6 pieces and spread around. The E.A. Bryan was essentially disintegrated. The dock was disintegrated. There was a fireball that went 12 miles in the air. And an Army Air Forces pilot saw this incredible explosion, and he didn't know what had happened, but it was so bad that the explosion could be heard for 50 miles around. And it registered as an earthquake at the Berkeley earthquake center with a Richter scale. It was that serious. So after the explosion, all of the white officers were given 30 days of compassionate leave. The Black soldiers were sent to Mare Island for alternate duties, and 2 weeks later were marched back to the naval magazine to begin reloading munitions. 258 of them refused to load unless there were safety measures put into place to protect them, because they were afraid after what they had seen. Well, the Navy threatened them with mutiny, which in time of war is the death penalty. 203 of them went back to work, or 208 of them, and 50 of them still refused to go to work. And they were tried in the biggest mutiny trial in Navy history. And this was a huge civil rights issue in the United States among the Black community, because at the time, the NAACP, they were not allowed to defend the Black sailors. The head of the chief counsel for the NAACP was a young lawyer from Baltimore named Thurgood Marshall, and he said, I watched the entire trial, and these men were put on trial because they were Black. And it's pretty clear that there was such a blatant sense of racism. And this really made an enormous impact, to the point where finally, as the war ended, attitudes were changing towards, obviously, women, towards African Americans, across the board. But this was a particularly seminal issue. And in fact, the Navy, 2 years before Truman's order to desegregate the military, 1948, 2 years before, the Chief of Naval Operations desegregated the Navy. So here's a picture of the memorial. You can visit this, but you have to book a trip, because it's still an active naval magazine where they do load munitions still, not right at this spot, up the river a bit. But you can visit this, and it's a very interesting visit. So let's talk about the Bay Area. Okay, I'm going on and on here. I'm going to speed it up. The Bay Area and the atomic bomb. The Bay Area had a very important role to play with the atomic bomb, because these physicists, 2 of the most important ones, Oppenheimer and Ernest Lawrence, taught at Berkeley, did research at Berkeley. And they were doing research which was very important for setting the science for the atomic bomb. And this picture is not very good. I apologize for this, but it has 2 Nobel Prize winners in here, Edwin McMillan. Anybody ever heard of him? Okay, well, his work with Glenn Seaborg, he actually is credited with discovering plutonium. There's a physicist in the back, he knows who he is. But he's in this picture, and so is Ernest Lawrence. But they set and did this work that was very important for learning about plutonium and how it would later be used for an atomic bomb. And so again, with the Bay Area connection, when the successful Trinity test happened, C-47 transport planes brought atomic bomb components from Kirtland in New Mexico to Hamilton Field up here in Nevada, okay? And then a special caravan went down to Hunters Point, and those bomb components were loaded on the USS Indianapolis, a heavy cruiser. The USS Indianapolis set out for Tinian. It set the record for the fastest crossing to Hawaii from San Francisco that still stands. It went to Tinian and dropped off the bomb components. And then, as you all know, the first bomb, which was a uranium device, Little Boy, was dropped on Hiroshima on August 6th, 1945. And then Fat Man was the plutonium implosion device, and it was dropped on Nagasaki 3 days later. There's a very sad postscript to this, and that is when the Indianapolis had dropped off the bomb components, it then set out for Leyte Gulf, but was sunk by a Japanese submarine. And 854 sailors died terrible death in the water from thirst, hypothermia, and shark attacks. The war ends in 1945, and immediately the shipyards did not need to be building the ships. And who do you think were the first people to lose their jobs? The women, yeah, and also in some cases African Americans, but especially the women. And it was actually the case that the shipyards estimated that half of their female workforce had children at home, and 1/5 of them were the primary breadwinners of their families, and suddenly they were unemployed. So this created some social upheaval and economic upheaval. But, the country was addressing this. How would Americans respond to the post-war period? Would they go back to their old lives? Well, a lot of the women and African Americans were not going to go back to the old lives. And if it wasn't them, it was their daughters who would organize to fight for equal rights for women, African Americans for economic justice. And students weren't going to be muzzled anymore either. They chafed under very strict rules by the university to prohibit political activities. And long before the protests in Vietnam, out at Cal Berkeley, there was a movement to fight the university and to get the freedom for political activity on campus. We know about the free speech movement, don't we? 1964. By the way, check out how the men were dressed then. Okay, yeah. 1964 in Berkeley. And they pioneered, they utilized some of the tactics of the civil rights movement, such as the sit-in. And it laid the way for protests that would soon come against the draft and against the Vietnam War. And once again, the Bay Area went to war. San Francisco, April 15th, 1967, one of the protests. Stanford. Okay, so last slide and then I'll conclude, and that is that even today, the Bay Area is playing a prominent role in supporting national security. High-tech companies here are providing a lot of the important digital communications for command, control, intelligence, and other things with computers, and are also building and designing some of the artificial intelligence weapon systems that are being built, autonomous weapon systems using AI. So that partnership is still there. So I want to thank you for your attention. I apologize I went long, and I'll be happy to take some questions.
Thank you. We have a brief time for questions and answers for Mark. Do we have any questions? Oh, we do? I'll get you right over there. And there's one over there, Lynn.
If I talk a long time, then there's not many questions and people can just leave, and it's a lot easier on me.
Thank you very much. I remember seeing the Carl Vinson in San Francisco Bay.
Did you?
Yeah, where is it now and what's it doing?
Oh, it's probably out floating around causing problems in the Middle East, or I don't know where its base is, but it's probably on the Pacific coast. So it would be going back and forth to Japan. And right now, also, the Navy is showing the flag in around Taiwan. So you would probably see them doing freedom of navigation missions around Taiwan right now. Sorry?
Hello?
Yeah.
Hello?
Well, the super carriers are very, very big. They are huge. By the way, here's another trivia question for you. What's the second largest? The largest ships are the super carriers, right? What's the second largest ship? Ballistic missile submarines. The Nimitz-class carriers come in at 95,000 tons. Ballistic missile submarines come in at 60,000 tons. The next biggest warship, is a guided missile destroyer. They come in about 14,000 by comparison. Ballistic missile submarines are huge. Yes, ma'am.
What was the verdict on the 60 for mutiny?
Okay. Thank you for asking. I had it in there. I didn't say. They deliberated for exactly 80 minutes, and they convicted them all. They were sentenced to 15 years of hard labor and a dishonorable discharge. Now, for many years, their sentences were later, much later commuted, so they served some time. They were commuted, however. There was an effort made for years to have them be pardoned, and it's only last year that they finally got pardons for those. All of them are dead now, though. Yes, back there?
Yes, I just wanted to say that I was an eyewitness to the Contra Costa explosion. It happened that night, and you could see it from my bedroom.
Wow.
And
Where were you?
I lived in Martinez.
Okay.
My father was an optometrist downtown. It blew out all the windows downtown
In Martinez.
in Martinez,
Yeah.
which was probably 15 miles away, maybe.
Yeah.
I don't know. And we had two ducts between two garages. It blew them out into the street, across the street, the backyards of the people that lived on the other side of the street. It was really quite an experience to witness.
Yeah. Yeah. It was a terrible tragedy for sure. One of the greatest conventional explosions in world history, the biggest probably being the Halifax explosion during World War I. I'm not, I'll just take whoever's next.
Given the advent of technology, what we know is that the next coming wars will probably be rained from the sky. I'm wondering what your thoughts are on the possibilities of having the San Francisco Bay Area targeted or becoming a prime target for attack.
Target from like Russia, China, North Korea. Is that what you mean?
An invader of some kind.
Well, an invader, not so much. A target for nuclear weapons, absolutely. We have been a target since probably the 1950s. We have many, many more thermonuclear weapons out there than we have good targets to blow up. So, the Russians could blow every city up in the United States and then go back over and start over again, and we can do the same to them.
And our last question here.
Correct me if I'm wrong, but part of the reason for the tragedy of the Indianapolis was the secrecy of its cargo and, more importantly, the secrecy of its location. Is that correct?
Well, the Indianapolis was sunk after it delivered its cargo. So it was now going on a mission to Leyte Gulf, and it would not have had any more secrecy than any other Navy ship that's operating operationally. But this was another really terrible tragedy because they court-martialed the captain and it wasn't his fault. They did not give him any of the intelligence about Japanese submarines operating in the area. So this came as a big shock when one popped up and then sank the ship. And there's a whole bunch of books written about this, and it's itself a very interesting piece of World War II history. Thanks for bringing that up.
We'd like to thank Mark for another awesome presentation, Bay Area,